So Chris DeWitt is from the University of South Africa, and his paper this morning or afternoon or evening or wherever you are, middle of the night, is Nemesius of Emesa on pleasure, desire, and sex. No, it's not. Chris is giving a different paper, and he will tell you the title. My apologies. Thanks, Chris.
Apologies for that. I need to share a screen. Could I perhaps get permission to share? Thank you, colleagues. It's wonderful to see all of you, and I've really been missing everyone, so it's good to be here. I apologize for not being able to speak about Nemesius. Our library has been closed for the past 3 months, which has made it so difficult to actually get that research done, and I'm not satisfied with the paper yet, so I'd rather not make a fool of myself with that. And I'm busy with another paper that I'm finishing up for our first ReMeDHe book, and in fact comments on that would really be helpful. So so the title of my paper, let me share the screen here for a minute, just 1 second, apologies. Okay, just see that it shares. Can everyone see the shared screen? It's a PowerPoint presentation. Okay, thank you. So there you have my my title. So I'll also dive right in. So the use of medical discourses is never neutral or innocent. During late antiquity, medical knowledge was disseminated through various alternative literary genres, such as homilies, hagiographies, ascetic treatises, and theological treatises. The social effects of this epistemological shift in medical discourse, however, requires further examination. The purpose of my discussion today specifically is to ask first how medical discourse shaped the formation of late antique Christian identities, and second, how medical discourse was utilized in the fashioning of alterities, or at least the formations of otherness. What I hope to achieve with this study is a better understanding of the power dynamics of medical discourse when utilized in contexts that are not conventionally associated with medicine and healthcare. This discussion is an exploration into the medically constructed self and other. I must admit that much of my evidence is limited to the late antique East, upon which, for the sake of time, my focus will be. And what I also want to say is, I'm not saying everything is medical, but what I'm saying is that discourse is pervasive enough to pick it up in a lot of these literary genres, so I'll get to that in a second. So let us begin how medical discourse shaped early Christian understandings of subjectivity. Take the following words of Theodoret of Cyrus from his Curatio Affectionem Graecorum, I quote, if a medical treatment, iatrike therapia, exists for the body, one should also exist for the soul. For while it is true that frequent ailments beset both body and soul, bodily ailments are for the most part involuntary, while spiritual ailments are voluntary, unquote. Here we see the most crucial move in early Christian medical discursive strategies, namely the inclusion of the entire human subject into the realm and grip of the medical. This was, of course, not a novel move. At least 2 decades ago, scholars like Antigone Semelas, L. Michael White, and Teresa Shaw, and more recently in the past few years, Wendy Meyer, Blake Lively, and Yannis Papadogiannakis, to name but a few, have shown how early Christian thought was shaped by ancient Greek philosophical thought about moral pathology and progress and emotional therapies. The body and the material soul became subject to medical technologies aimed at restoring or improving the individual. In Christian thought particularly, the cure of the soul receives a position of primacy over the health of the body, although these two states of health are often related. Some bodily ailments might even be symptomatic of various psychic disorders. At times, psychic and bodily health correspond. For instance, John Chrysostom makes it clear that the individual who exercises moderate self-control, who does not indulge in the passions, often enjoys a great degree of physical health. In other cases, psychic and bodily health stand in contrast to one another. In some schools of early Christian ascetic thought, disease even functions as a form of ascesis in itself, since it breaks down and weakens the body, similar to other rigorous ascetic disciplines. Andrew Crislip speaks of, and I quote, illness as an ascetic practice, rightly, in my opinion. The Christian monastic handbooks of late antiquity often function as moral pathological maps of the body and the soul, in which every aspect of the individual is catalogued and discussed within some broad scope of medical discourse. For instance, Philoxenus of Marburg's Memre to monks start with treatments related to strengthening one's faith, down to issues of what to eat and how to control and manage bodily processes, from sexual desire to physical and psychic aging. Philoxenus even applies the common medical principle of opposites to the healing dynamics of the entire individual. He writes, and I quote, similar to how medicines are mixed and prepared by physicians for physical illnesses, medicines against the passions of sins are prepared and made ready by the Spirit of God, in order that whoever is aware of an illness may find the medicine for it at his side, and from close by bring aid to himself. Everything, for the most part, is healed by its opposite, because the opposition of medicine will fight with the harm of the disease. Therefore, take an example from here, O discerning one who wishes to heal the ailments of the soul, and provide for your soul something that performs the art of healing to the body. On account of this, the work of external things is placed before our eyes, so that it might be an example of instruction for those things that are internal. And we might heal the soul from the diseases of evil things, similar to the way the body is healed. Let us prepare against each of the passions of sin the antidote that is the opposite of the disease. End quote. Such handbooks like those of Philoxenus, and we can add among others those of John the Solitary, even Isaac of Nineveh, function as apparatuses that enable the individual to examine his or her own soul and body, whether it be a thought that might kindle the flame of lust or a pang of hunger that might lead to gluttony, and then resort to the necessary medical treatment of a particular ailment. The identity of the individual subject is therefore firstly shaped by the simultaneous dichotomization and unification of the body and soul, and the meticulous and exhaustive cataloging of the individual parts of the subject as a whole. Now, much more could be said on this point, but for now I will provide my first thesis, which is early Christian medical discourse was a totalizing discourse that encompassed the entire individual subject in body and soul, and fixed the individual body and soul with meticulous and exhaustive detail by means of apparatuses like monastic handbooks within the realm of the medical. The totalizing arrogation of the individual body and soul by early Christian medical discourse is also mirrored by a similar arrogation of the social body. So the individual body is mapped in these monastic handbooks, but then we find something similar to the social body. The notion of encyclopedism has often been used to describe many of the medical literary outputs of late antiquity. In this regard, we have the major collections of authors like Oribasius of Pergamum, Aetius of Amida, Paul of Aegina, and others, who appropriated earlier sources like Galen and others quite extensively in the creation of medical quasi-encyclopedias. Some Christian authors like Nemesius of Emesa and John the Solitary followed suit, imbuing their maps of the individual subject with the authority of Aristotle or Galen. In this way, these authors actually claim epistemological capital, and an author like Galen is practically Christianized. But there is no such thing as mere encyclopedism. The very act of compiling such mammoth tomes of knowledge is both a totalizing and imperializing act. These encyclopedias are not simply manuals or digests, but represent attempts at rationalizing, ordering, and institutionalizing knowledge under the precepts of empire. It becomes an epistemological quest, or I prefer colonization, because there is choice, preference, and exclusion of material involved. Thus, we have the extensive mapping of the individual subject in the monastic handbooks, and then also, I believe, in these medical encyclopedias, we have the social body. In which, so the social body is mapped, ordered, and constructed in a similar medically discursive way with the rise of the great heresiological and polemical treatises of late antiquity. Such extensive heresiologies and polemical treatises represent what we might understand as medical encyclopedias of social pathology. Todd Berzon's excellent work on the classification of late ancient heresiology demonstrates clearly how heresiology functions as an imperial form of knowledge, not very different from other forms or collections like, I would say, the medical encyclopedias or even the legal digests. A heresiology like that of Epiphanius provides an excellent example of the type of encyclopedizing tendencies we have in early Christian imperial forms of medicalized knowledge. The Panarion represents a type of encyclopedic medicine chest against the psychic poisons of heresy. Heretical knowledge is here likened to something like snake bites. Just as the individual subject in body and soul is mapped out, ordered, and organized in the monastic handbooks, so too is the social body mapped out and ordered so as to protect Orthodox Christians against heresy. The various heresies are given names, some of which the heretical groups, in fact, may have never called themselves, and then classified according to the danger they pose to the communal body and soul of the church. Epiphanius needs to name the heretics. Naming, of course, is a form of subjugating the others. This is how the ancient people understood naming. It's like when Adam names the animals. Most ancient authors says when Adam names the animals, he also subjugates them. And that's why we also have a lot of negative animal imagery in Epiphanius, which is very curious and interesting. Theodoret's Curatio aims to correct, by means of medical discourse, not heresy, but rather Greek philosophy and religious practices. But the discursive operations and aims of Epiphanius' Panarion and Theodoret's Curatio, I would say, are very similar. They name and classify pathological social subjects and aim to correct or anathematize the groups associated with the heresies. Heresiology also becomes an act of containment or quarantine in which socially and spiritually dangerous heresies are set apart and marked as being dangerous. My second thesis is therefore this. Early Christian medical discourse was also a totalizing and imperial discourse that mapped out, classified, rationalized, ordered, and institutionalized the social body, especially in emergent literary genres that exhibit encyclopedizing, sorry about that, tendencies. English is not my first language, so sorry if I stumble. The result of these totalizing and imperializing tendencies in early Christian medical discourse is the personification of moral pathology and moral health. In late antiquity, we see the development of numerous figures or exempla within medical discourse. Late antiquity is a period of figures. Certain figures function as strategies of cohesion within a group, while other figures have alterizing or othering functions. Some of these figures are directly borrowed from Greek and Roman moral philosophy, such as the figure of the slave of the passions. In this case, pathic excess becomes the major cause of various psychic and physical ailments. The notion of the slave of the passions is very common in polemical treatises, and it is probably the closest ancient equivalent of what we understand today as the addict or the obsessive individual. Addiction and obsession are important, yet highly neglected medical discourses in late antiquity. When one reads, for instance, Libanius's 25th oration, in which I initially, which I could not find an English translation of, but which one could entitle as On Slavery, Daidulea, one might be surprised or disappointed, like me, to read that his oration says practically nothing about the institution of late antique slavery. The oration is all about the enslavement to the passions, and the title might be translated more appropriately, which I'm currently doing, as On Addiction and Obsession. So I think we have, with the history of slavery, also histories of addiction. But the addiction cannot be separated from the addict in this case. The excessive indulgence in the various passions is personified in the figure of the slave of the passions. And this is actually how I got into medical discourse, and my interest in ancient medicine was via slavery, and because it's so closely related. So it often happens that opponents of Christian authors, whether they are heretics or Greeks or whatever other appellation, are described as slaves of the passions. Some are slaves of the stomach, others are slaves of lust or greed, and some are even described as being enslaved to demonic teachings. But this act of discursive enslavement, it is yet another imperializing tendency of early Christian medical discourse. Empires make slaves. This is what they do. Empires also make war. The presence of the rhetoric of warfare in early Christian medical discourse further affirms this point. Theodoret writes, and I'm sorry I don't have this on the PowerPoint, for some reason I missed it. God has assigned appropriate remedies to the two parts of our nature, and has even instituted specialized medicines for one kind for the body and another for the soul, and has given them as prescriptions in the war against diseases in order to overcome them, unquote. So the response against moral pathology is an imperial response of coercion or warfare. Even in modern medical discourse, this idea of the war against something is common, and that has interesting links to gender and masculinity and stuff, which I won't go into now. In addition to slavery, we often find individuals that are othered by discourses of madness. Heretics are often described as being insane and frenzied, a danger to society. In some cases, the notion of the brain fever or phrenitis is used to classify the heretic, which Jessica Wright has done a lot of great work on. Now, as a correlate to the development of these figures of otherness, we also have exemplar of health being constructed. The figure of the preacher as a doctor of the soul is a good example of this. Monks, who are also called slaves of God, which I've argued becomes a technical title for a monk in late antiquity, are often described as being exemplary of psychic health, even when their physical health is compromised. Historical figures like Paul and the martyrs are often hailed as surgeons of the soul who are able to extract and cure even the most serious psychic and moral pathologies through their words. So my third thesis is therefore, moral and psychic pathologies are personified through naming and classification. And from early Christian medical discourse, we see the development of figures like the Pathic slave, the frenzied heretic, and the ironically foolish and ethnically stereotyped Greek. The assault against moral pathology is therefore also an assault against the pathologically personified other, as is evident in the language of war, enslavement, madness, and so on. Anyone who has read monastic books and curses will know that often the cure for a psychic problem is not very pleasant. Sometimes it's even death, isn't it? Particularly in the Syrian texts. Finally, early Christian medical discourse was a popular and perhaps even a populist discourse. This facet is evident in the fact that many late ancient Christian homilies are permeated with medical discourse, the homilies particularly. Through popular preaching, Christian medical discourse was disseminated not only to the literate and wealthy elite, but even to the masses. Even if all did not necessarily have the means to take care of the health of the soul, which requires otium, the luxury of free time and discipline, the presence of the discourse itself was enough to fix it in the early Christian popular imagination. Few Christian authors are as exemplary in this regard as John Chrysostom. As Wendy Mayer has shown, one of the primary ways in which Chrysostom fashioned his own identity was in the shape of the therapist of the soul. In his treatise on the providence of God, Chrysostom states, and I quote, "When doctors intend to treat those with a fever or those sick with some other illness, they first seek to see the afflicted ones themselves. Since they are far away, they are unable to provide an opinion. Such is the art of medicine, and such is the nature of these illnesses. But we who are earnest to treat not one or two, but all in the world who have been scandalized, do not require anything like that. By preparing the medicine of words," this is important, the medicine of words, "which for the sick becomes all these things, and better than all we have mentioned. Thus, having prepared this medicine, we are sending it to everyone, and I know that everyone will benefit from the treatment provided they pay heed with the exactitude and right-mindedness to what is said," unquote. So Christian medical discourse was affirmed through its enunciation. Not only was Christian imperial rhetoric a medical discourse per se, but it was the actual medicine. The very healing process, which was one in which words were central. Here in this passage, Chrysostom seems to hint that the medicine that certainly. Here in this passage, Chrysostom seems to hint that the medicine of preaching the word acts like mass medical treatment. The medicine of the word is not subject to the limitations of conventional medical treatment. Most of all, Chrysostom states, and I quote, and it does this without causing any money to be spent and without increasing poverty. Think about discourses of medicine and economies. So the medicine of the word is free and available to all. Thus, the themes of wealth and poverty are interwoven with early Christian medical discourse. My final thesis is then, early Christian medical discourse was a popular, perhaps populist discourse, which was perpetuated through its very enunciation. Christian medical discourse was not only about healing for the individual, the discourse itself was the medicine, and it was available to the masses. In conclusion, one way in which late ancient Christian identity and otherness were constructed was by means of medical discourse. And as I said in the beginning, it doesn't mean everything is medical. But the self was both deconstructed and reconstructed through meticulous and exhaustive technologies and practices of mapping and ordering the individual subject in body and soul. A similar type of mapping was also applied to the social body with the heresiological treatises. More than anything, late antique Christian medical discourse was an imperializing discourse. By understanding this aspect of late antique Christian medical discourse, we have been able to examine the dynamics of the discourse from a bird's eye view, thereby making connections between genres of late antique literature that seems at first rather unrelated. Despite important differences between the various genres of literary outputs mentioned in this paper, the aims of genres like medical encyclopedias, heresiologies, apologetic and polemical treatises, monastic handbooks, and homilies might not, in many senses, have been all that different. And I think a sensitivity to these discursivities and power strategies might help us further, in speaking about decolonizing patristics itself as a field. But that's a discussion for another day, and my thoughts are wandering. So from my side, thank you very, very much for listening to me, and it was fun. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Chris. So we do have some time for questions. We started a few minutes late, so we'll shift everything into the break a little bit. But for those of you who arrived after we talked about this, our first presenter after break has had to cancel, so we have a bit of extra time to work with today. Ellen, please go ahead.
Chris, thank you for this paper. I'm excited by it, and also I'm excited at the prospect of getting to ask you this question, because it's something I've been trying to figure out how to how to articulate. So maybe you have a better sense of it than I do. And you say, you know, this doesn't mean that everything is medicine, and I'm on board with that. I wonder what are the criteria for distinguishing between, say, when an early Christian writer is using something as a metaphor or as a template. Like the first slide from Theodoret is like, if there is this, then there's something, a treatment for the, you know, if there's treatments for the body, then there's a treatment for the soul. Or like Philoxenus is like similar to how there are treatments for this, then we also have these other things. So what criteria would you use to distinguish between when an early Christian author is using medicine as a template or a metaphor or a pattern, and when there's epistemological collapse between early Christian discourse and medicine?
Thanks. That's a great question, and you know, it's one that I've been struggling with regards to slavery as well, because often when you read slavery, it's exactly the same thing. You don't know where the metaphor stops and reality begins, and it's with medical discourse I find very much the same. So Wendy Mayer wrote a great article on this issue about metaphor, where she actually you know, she's done great work in this regard, and together we've thought about this, and she's used conceptual metaphor theory to unpack this question, and I don't think and I tend to follow Wendy's argument, and I tend to agree with her that it's not always the one or the other, and that's why it's interesting that even when an author uses medicine simply, I use simply very carefully here, because you know, there's not mere metaphor or simple metaphor. But let's say he uses it simply as a metaphor. The fact that the discourse itself is supposed to be therapeutic means that the metaphor is part of the therapy. Does that make sense? It's tricky stuff, but the metaphor is part of the therapy. So on the one hand, there's metaphor, you know, proceeding from conceptual metaphor theory. I do think that it's not always as easy to discern. You know, often, I mean, to talk about slavery again, just a lot of people would say, well, you know, the idea of the slave of God is a metaphor. And I disagree with that. I don't think these ancient people saw that as a metaphor. I think they saw themselves as actual slaves to a spiritual being. So it's a difficult question, Alan. I have an exact answer and to give certain criteria of what would be metaphor and what would not. And I think it's actually both, because if it is just a metaphor, the larger discourse itself is supposed to be therapeutic. I haven't really answered it, I'm sorry. Yeah. Is there another question?
Heidi.
He's muted.
Sorry, that was an inevitability. The next person who had their hand up has the name Richard Beale.
Well, actually, I'm Joanne Skurlock, but
thank you. Sorry,
I registered because it's his email. But anyway,
Yeah.
okay. On the metaphor issue, I think I'd like to support the speaker on that. St. Paul says that Jews are slaves to the law. He doesn't mean, he means slavery. He really does. Of the term slaves, it sounds like exaggerations or metaphors, but they're not. They actually mean that. Anyway, and as far as, I mean, the words being healing, look, faith healing, we still have that. And to remember that early Christianity is much closer to some of these sort of what we consider like fringe groups now. And as said, they spoke in tongues, they did these sort of things. So that impression on the emphasis on faith healing, which would involve actual words being used in some sense. Okay, that wasn't what I wanted to talk about, however. I do ancient Near East, all right, so, and I do medicine specifically, so this is why I'm interested. I want to make an objection to the idea that empires aren't necessarily evil, and that encyclopedias are necessarily evil, and that encyclopedias done by empires are necessarily evil. I'm working on a translation of encyclopedia at the moment as we speak. And what is striking about it is that some things in and you take something out. Well, yes, they do. But what they did, and we can prove that they did this, was all previous versions of the manuscript were kept, just in case they wanted to decide to put that something that they had left out back in again. In other words, there was no attempt to squelch knowledge or to control knowledge or to do it in a certain direction. The idea was to have useful things in a useful order necessary, or that everybody knew that. But they gave us always to come back and correct it if that idea should change. And we can see that things from various a millennium, literally earlier version of the text they're working on were not used in between and came up in the latest version of it. So back up again, they decided, hey, wait a minute, that we shouldn't have taken that out. That needs to go back in. Bam, back in it went. So anyway, I just wanted to, having working on an encyclopedia project, I can tell you how these things were actually done. Now, I have no quarrel with Christian uses of this and othering and all this sort of thing. That's fairly obvious, but don't blame it on empires and encyclopedias. Okay, that's all I'm saying.
Thank you for that. Obviously, I'm not an expert in your field, so I don't have my focus was on the Roman period and yeah, I wouldn't. I don't.
Okay, the Roman Empire is evil. All right, I have no quarrel.
Well,
with it,
you know,
but...
I wouldn't. I don't think I said that. That encyclopedias are evil, but there's something pervasive going on, and I would be interested to see the ancient encyclopedias, but often the thing with power discourse is it's sometimes very difficult to get a grip on, and at that moment, particularly in pre-modern societies where you have low literacy, an encyclopedia is a very powerful thing. It is a centralization of knowledge. Even if you keep the manuscripts, that encyclopedia itself is a new object. It is a new ordering, and the fact that you can reorder and add things again, which makes it fluid, adds to that power. It adds to it, I would say. So it's not so much to say it's evil but there are very pervasive power dynamics present, and I'm a faculty. I think a lot will go. So when I say these, I speak
philosopher, but
yeah, no, sure. He's my favorite. So but when we say things happen. That's Foucault's big point. So yeah, I think that's the point. I think it might be difficult to. I would not. I think we should perhaps compare apples with apples, and I really did not look at those materials, and it might be different. I think we need to contextualize. So I cannot sit here and say my findings are relevant for all empires and all encyclopedias. I haven't done that. Yeah.
Well, I mean, thank you. Clearly have I'm not arguing with your point about what's going on with the Christian ones. That point. The point is, I was trying to say it's coming from within the Christian need to alter people's identities so that they become something that they have never been before. And conversion, what we call conversion, but basically that's the same process. That the need to do that is something which is not necessarily present, and the others are just collections of knowledge. We actually know what the king who commissioned this wanted. He was the first king who actually learned how to read and write. You overestimate the power of things that are written in an illiterate society. If you don't know about it, it doesn't affect you. You see, that's the problem. It has to be communicated to you. So if you can read it yourself, you look at social media, how fast things can travel when everybody can read and you have illiterate. And also literacy was not used as a weapon when even the movers and shakers of society do not read and write. And that was true even in the Middle Ages in Europe. The upper class, essentially, the knights and whatever, the people who controlled things were illiterate. It was their brother who went and became a priest and learned how to read and so forth. So you have or barely literate, I should say. It's only in the modern world really that literacy becomes a weapon in that way. It's the spoken word. It's what you say. I'll agree with Foucault on that. It's what's said, not what's written, especially if you can't read what's on the text. that really has the
Sorry to
greatest.
interrupt.
Okay.
We-
Sorry, I'm very sorry.
We have to move on to the next paper. I apologize. And sorry, Christy, we're not going to get to your question now, but you'll
So
remember
sorry.
it.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
That's all right, but I'm the timekeeper and I want to make sure that Candace gets a chance to talk.
Definitely.
So Candace Buckner from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, welcome. And we're very pleased to have you speak with us today and to us. Candace, are you comfortable being recorded or do you want me to turn the record off?
The recording's fine. Also, can you share screen? And I guess I should update,
Yes.
I've moved to Virginia Tech. So that's a.
Oh, sorry. Yep. I will make you co-host and then I will read the name of your paper, which is On the Verge of Life and Death, Obstetric and Perinatal Anxiety in the Coptic Life of Aaron. So take it away, Candace.
Well, let's see if my screen sharing is working properly.
I did make you co-host, so hopefully.
No, it might be something on my end because this is my newly returned computer after a hard drive death. So right now it seems to, when I press share, let me see if I do this. It does not. Okay. So here's what I will do.
What I'll do is I'll try withdrawing co-host permission from Chris to see if that, I don't know if that's something that's going to work. Does that allow you to do anything? Still no?
It's an issue where I can't see the image that I want. So it's like it's not showing me. So let me do.
One possible solution is you could send me the PowerPoint to my email and I can try and share it if it's critical that we have it.
It would just be easier, I think. I'm going to share it with you then, because it's also a Google slide, so you can.
Let me know if there's something you want or need me to do, Candace.
Yeah, I think I just added you, and so you should be able. It's labeled ReMeDHe Conference. Yep.
Okay, and there we go. Okay, and then slides. Okay. Okay, I'm supposed to have a code. Not working. Sorry, it doesn't seem to. I don't have a code to go with it, Candace.
Interesting. It doesn't offer me to send you a code.
Yeah, so that doesn't work.
Okay. I actually.
Oh, there's a verification code. Okay, sorry. I see.
Sorry.
Hang on. Sorry, folks. This is the part where we can't figure out how to hook up the computer to the projector at a real conference. All right. Now, then I will try and find Zoom again on my screen. And okay, I'm going to. Why is it not letting me share my screen now? I'm sorry, everyone.
I apologize. You know what? the other thing that I could do.
Oh, there, that's why. Okay, got it. Never mind. Let's go.
All righty.
You just have to tell me when I need to switch slides.
Yeah. So I think I'll press present, I think. It's in the top right corner for you.
Okay.
By the share button.
Okay.
Yeah, there you go. All righty. So, as Heidi mentioned, the title of this paper today is On the Verge of Life and Death, Obstetric and Perinatal Anxiety in the Coptic Life of Aaron. So, let's begin. A little late. Thank you guys for being patient. In 2019, Scientific American published an article entitled, and slide,
Okay.
to prevent women dying in childbirth, first stop blaming them. The article goes on to relay the troubling state of maternal health care in the US and the equally troubling trend of blaming women for their own deaths. By attempting to redress the treatment of women in our article, Monica R. McLemore, and highlighting how modern medicine in the US has failed to address the needs of diverse groups of women, it struck me that McLemore participates in a much larger ongoing narrative concerning the anxiety surrounding women in childbirth. In fact, she frames her article with these words. Slide. The shameful secret is out. Although the number of women who die in childbirth globally has fallen in recent decades, the rates in the US have gone up. Her words express an age-old fear that the perinatal period, or the period immediately prior, during, after birth, remains marked by uncertainty for women. Approximately 2,500 years ago, the same sentiment appears in Euripides' Medea. She decries, then men also say that we women live lives quietly away from danger at home. The men go off to war. And slide here. Wrong, one birth alone is worse than 3 times in the battlefield without a shield. Fear of death in the birthing bed has echoed through time. Indeed, the same fear present in McLemore's article and Euripides appears in the episode from the Coptic Life of Aaron under discussion today, in which a woman almost dies in childbirth. Set in Upper Egypt in the areas near Aswan and Philae, the life, though composed in the 6th century CE, preserves stories from the 4th and 5th, and as a result, it offers a snapshot of a Christian community on Egypt's southern frontier over time, with special attention to its problems and concerns. The story of the woman's difficult birthing experience fits well into this literary framework. In the episode, an unnamed woman cries out in fear when the child she is attempting to birth dies inside her. Immediately, the child leaves her body, but the story does not end here. The woman's parents and husband travel to Abba Aaron, the titular character, to ask for him to heal the boy. Ultimately, they are successful when they return home. Throughout this domestic crisis, the text emphasizes how the woman has been on the verge of death. She voices this concern. Slide. For had I not entreated the God of the holy man Abba Aaron, I too would have sunk into death.
It's not working. Sorry. All of a sudden stopped working.
Oh no.
Oh,
When the family.
is that good? Is that where we're going?
Yes, that's the one. When the family travels to Aaron, they too acknowledge that she was so close to death. This emphasis on the mother's near death overshadows the entire tale. In fact, I would argue that by presenting the episode in terms of the laboring woman's near-death experience, the life underscores both the banality of women suffering in childbirth, but also understands her death as a real potential outcome of the birthing bed. In doing so, the text echoes ancient medical thought and popular thought around the dangers of stillborn fetuses to their mothers, and advances a Christian imagining of the perinatal female body as one that inhabits a liminal position, living but potentially dead. New slide.
No.
Okay. First, I will begin with a detailed introduction into the narrative account, then turn to a brief discussion of the late antique literary accounts of traumatic childbirth, and then I'll turn to medical thought concerning the dangers of stillborn children, followed by a discussion of the liminality of the woman in the midst of childbirth, and then give a brief conclusion. So let's begin. The event is described as a domestic crisis, and it unfolds as follows. And here I'm giving you a bit more of a detailed account of what happens. Quote, when a woman from Philai was about to give birth, her child got stuck inside her and died, end quote. The woman then, fearing her death, remembers the miracles that God worked through the holy man Abba Aaron, and she cries out saying, God of the holy Abba Aaron, may you listen to me in this hour of need. After her entreaty, the text explains, immediately she gave birth to the small, dead boy. Her parents, presumably present for the birth of the child, greatly mourn his death. Seeing her parents' overtures of grief, she confronts them, emphasizing her birth experience as follows. Why are you so heavy-hearted about the child? For had I not entreated the God of the holy man Abba Aaron, I too would have sunk into death. In response, her parents say nothing. Instead, they, along with the child's father, make haste to Abba Aaron's abode, seeking his aid. When they arrive, Aaron inquires why they have traveled to him, and they beseech him, saying, we have come to meet your holiness, accept this small gift of money from us, and pray for the little boy that he may live for his mother's sake. For his mother invoked your name at the moment she was about to give birth. If not, they both would have died. Aaron listens and eventually informs them, now as for you, if you believe the gift of Christ, it will be given to you. Hearing his words, the family decides to return home, but not before the father gathers some soil from Aaron's threshold and puts it in his cloak. Once they arrive back at their homestead, they are greeted with a room full of neighbors, the woman and the stillborn child. The father, amidst all of these witnesses, proceeds to take the soil from his pocket and sprinkle it on the dead infant. And immediately the child moved his legs and opened his eyes. And so, oh, we are back. It's moving.
Oh, yeah, that was my mistake. So what slide should I move forward? No.
We are on slide 14.
Okay. Okay,
There.
keep going.
Yep. Yep, right, that's where we are. And despite the happy ending of the episode, I remain fascinated with two elements of the text, namely, the way the woman is described as coming so close to death, and the way the same woman rebukes her parents for what she views as their overzealous mourning. It is one of the episode's greatest ironies that when the woman's family entreat Aaron, they explain, and then slide, accept this small gift of money from us and pray for the little boy that he may live for his mother's sake. When a few sentences before, the woman to whom they make reference has rebuked them while expressing no such sentiment. In fact, her words in the slide, why are you so heavy-hearted about the child? For had I not asked the God of the holy Abba Aaron, I too would have sunk into death, imply the opposite. Her words underscore a certain level of injustice. The woman seems to be worried that her family may mourn the child more than her, or at least her horrible experience. And perhaps she's equally horrified about what their grief may imply, that they wish she had died and the babe had lived. While we cannot know whether the text intends such a reading, it certainly remains a plausible one. It lurks in the daughter's accusation that she too would have died, if not for the intervention of Abba Aaron and his God. And then slide. And we're going to dramatic childbirth in ancient literature. So on the one hand, the healing of the mother and child follows standard elements of healing narratives in late ancient Christianity. The time period, as Andrew Cleaslip has noted, corresponds with the development of a burgeoning monastic healthcare system in which lay people viewed monasteries as places of healings. In the late antique imagination, Christians associated holy men not only with physical medicine, but they also imagined they could effect healing through prayer, the laying of hands, making the sign of the cross, and the application of blessed substances like oil or water. Assuredly, not only did they have these models, but they also had biblical ones. Note, the vivification of a stillborn child also could be said to parallel biblical models of raising the dead, like Lazarus. And finally, the text emphasis on the son mirrors Roman Egyptian familial concern over male heirs and their importance for the maintenance and continuation of the family. As Warren has argued the tales plays into a larger topos of fathers seeking aid for their children in the life and the societal significance and preference given to male offspring. In this slide, as she puts it, I have not yet discovered a comparable story in any ancient source that tells of a father's heart-wrenching pleas for the reanimation of a stillborn girl. End quote. On the other hand, the episode contains several elements that deviate from late ancient literature, not the least of which is the description of the woman's delivery in the first place. Greco-Roman literature offers a bevy of miraculous births and conceptions, think Leda and the Swan, but few detailed accounts of labor and delivery. Even Greek romance novels, which love a good telenovela-esque crisis, skip over the vagaries of childbirth. For instance, Heliodorus' Ethiopica, or Ethiopian story, hinges on the Ethiopian queen Persina's birth of a child with white skin as a result of maternal impression, the popular belief in antiquity and later that what a pregnant woman saw can impact a fetus. Yet it provides no description of her labor and delivery at all. Similarly, Christian literature reveals several instances of miraculous conceptions and birth, both biblical and apocryphal, especially around the resolution of barrenness. In these cases, things like Abraham and Sarah's conception of Isaac in Genesis 21, right? And of course, Mary's conception, labor, and delivery of Jesus found expression in the popular works of the Proto-Evangelium of James and the Gospel of Pseudo-Matthew. But in these texts, Mary's lack of pain, fluids, and anxiety, standard features of childbirth, are the hallmarks of her birth experience. Additionally, other than the biblical perspective that birth be painful, prescriptive that birth be painful, originally found in Genesis 3:16, biblical models for labor and delivery are woefully absent. And as for references to stillborn children, they appear on multiple occasions in biblical literature, such as Job 3:16 and Ecclesiastes 6:3, but no detailed account of stillbirth accompanies their mention. They are used frequently metaphorically to bemoan fate. Right? Needless to say, descriptions of more realistic birthing experiences, including the danger of them, remain rare. In fact, I know of only 2 other accounts of difficult labor. The first occurs in the sayings of the Desert Fathers in the section concerning Macarius the Great, and the other occurs in the Historia Monachorum in Egypto in the section dedicated to John of Nicopolis. In the former, a local virgin lies about the father of her child and implicates Macarius as her impregnator. Her duplicity is discovered during childbirth when she's unable to push out the babe. When asked why she labors for days unsuccessfully, she cries, slide, I know what it is. It is because I slandered the anchorite and accused him unjustly. It is not he who is to blame, but such and such young man. The dangerous pregnancy resonates with early Christian concern over the perceived licentiousness of women, the role of slander and gossip in monastic communities, and the fear of monastic failure in the face of feminine wiles. In the other mention, a high-ranking officer's wife has a difficult labor while her husband is away visiting John of Nicopolis. The text describes her predicament as follows. New slide. She gave birth and losing consciousness hovered on the brink of death. And later, when John announces to the father the birth of a healthy son, John describes the woman's state as, in new slide, his mother, however, has come very near to losing her life. Here, the text emphasizes monastic foresight and perspicacity, but not John's ability to heal despite his knowledge of her distress. Interestingly, in both accounts, the women never receive names. They are only identified by their social roles, and the holy men do not intercede on behalf of the laboring women. In the sayings of the Desert Fathers account, that oversight seems narratively reasonable. After all, she had accused him of fathering her child. In the HMA, the Historia Monachorum in Egypto, it seems unnecessarily cruel. Conversely, the account in the life of Aaron not only emphasizes Aaron, or at least the mention of his God, as crucial to its resolution, but also offers a description of an actual obstetric problem. Recall, the text explains the woman cried out, saying, and there's slide, God of the holy abbot Aaron, may you listen to me in this hour of need. And later, her parents inform Aaron and their daughter that their daughter invoked his name. Aaron, despite his absence, acts as a conduit to God and his curative powers. And, of course, she is in the throes of a child stuck in her uterus. In this sense, Aaron not only fulfills the function of both mediator and physician on behalf of the beleaguered woman, but he acts as the only viable option. She has no midwife who is with her. While the other holy men, John and Macarius, have no such role in the birth and delivery stories associated with them. It's a new style, stillbirth medical. More importantly, Aaron's intervention, new slide. Aaron's intervention, if I may call it that, resolves a serious medical crisis commonly understood as deadly. The text describes her predicament as her child got stuck inside her and died. Here it is important to note that bioarchaeological evidence and the historical record is very clear. Women and children died in childbirth, and infants could and did get stuck inside their mothers. For example, in 2018, and there should be a slide here, new slide. In 2018, a cemetery dated to the second millennia BCE in Aswan, Egypt, the exact area that serves as the setting for our text, revealed the remains of a woman with a child in her pelvis. What's more, not only do we have this evidence, but also ancient medical texts bear witness to an ongoing fear and anxiety over the possibility of a child becoming lodged in a woman's uterus, especially if it has died. Hippocrates, in his On the Nature of Women, composed sometime during the 4th and 5th centuries BCE, recommends violets and the fruit of purslane, also known as hogweed, suppositories made of blister beetle, and even cabbage to expel a dead fetus, just to name a few. Tyrannus, the 2nd century Greek physician who practiced primarily in Alexandria, explains in his work Gynecology, a new slide. Indeed, both menstruation and pregnancy are useful for the propagation of men, he quips. They're certainly not helpful for the child bearer. He goes on to explain the dangers of pregnancy and their curatives, including what one should do when a fetus becomes stuck in the uterus. And new slide. But if the embryo is dead, he writes, one must assist its complete expulsion by means of relaxing agents. The same text recommends forceful extraction, including embryotomy. And for those of you who don't know, embryotomy is the removal of the child from the uterus through surgical dismemberment for fetuses dislodged in the uterus. And finally, the 6th century Alexandrian trained physician, Aetius of Amida, continues this trend in book 16 of his Tetrabiblios, which is dedicated to obstetrics and gynecology. He recommends rubs, baths, and fumigations to expel a fetus that has become lodged in the uterus. He also recommends embryotomy, stating, and if this is unsuccessful, dislodging the child, one must dismember the fetus. This must also, by all means, be done if the fetus should be too large or if it should be dead. He goes on to dedicate the entirety of a chapter to the proper execution of fetal dismemberment. An unborn child, then, in the eyes of ancient medical texts, unable to leave its mother's womb, was a serious crisis, and the medical literature treats it as such. In light of this context, life's insistence that invoking the name of Aaron, or rather the God of Aaron, saving the woman's life, makes for a rather wondrous and commonplace miracle, if we can estimate anything from the number of solutions that these medical texts offer for removal of a dead fetus. New slide. The liminality of the childbearing woman. By emphasizing the miraculousness of the healing, the text also highlights another aspect of the woman in the throes of childbirth. She is a liminal figure. It is worth mentioning that the birth of a child was fraught with anxiety over whether the husband or larger family would accept the child as a part of the household and legitimate offspring. A father's rejection could result in scorn or possible death for the mother and child. In the case of miscarriage and stillbirth, women were often assumed to have engaged in some sort of negligence or purposeful malfeasance, and they could be subject to shunning or worse. As a grieving mother, Esther from the 6th century CE writes, on a new slide, I bear my children, they die. Perhaps I do something unfitting. Be so kind to send me a rule whereby I may walk, for my soul is grieved. Adding to the tenuous social position of these women was the real possibility of death. In the birthing bed, the woman had one foot with the living and another with the dead. The Historia Monacorum's account certainly advances this view with the description of the high-ranking officer's wife as on the brink of death and coming very near to losing her life. And it's certainly implied in these things of the dozen fathers that we read, that we saw earlier, when the fallen virgin is described as remaining in labor for many days without delivering the child. This sentiment also appears in Aetius when he discusses embryotomy with the explanation that it is necessary for the physician to examine the patient before undertaking the delivery to see if the woman will recover or not, whether she can be saved or given up lost. In all these texts, the woman in labor exists in a state of in-betweenness, alive but maybe shortly dead. Moreover, that liminality did not completely end at the birth or removal of a stillborn child. Slide. As Thavas, a woman in the 4th century, reminds us through her letter to her father, when you receive my letter, please come home at once because your poor daughter, ReMeDHe, has died. Even though she had already come safely through a miscarriage on the 9th of Paofi, for she gave birth to an 8th-month child dead, and she lived on for 4 days. And after that, she died and was given a funeral by us and her husband as was right, and has been transported to Labandius, the town of the birth. The perinatal period remained, in this sense, not only a socially tenuous place for women, but an actual tenuous place for women's lives. And this last type, and it is this last type of liminality that our episode embraces, the idea that women stood when on the birthing bed somewhere between an alive and dead state. The woman, of course, embraces this interpretation when she points out that if she had not entreated the God of the holy man Abba Aaron, she too would have sunk into death. We are left with the distinct impression that the woman has been chased by death itself and dodged it. So, conclusion. The striking account, new slide. The striking account of a woman's difficult labor and delivery of a stillborn boy in the Coptic life of Aaron offers more than a simple healing and animation. The details surrounding the curative of the woman and the vivification of the child challenges assumptions both about the responsibility of the woman in childbirth and the social standing of mothers after the birth of a newborn. In this story, the woman at least advocates for the importance of her own life, and God himself listens. And more importantly, the text names no blame at her feet for the death of the child. The narrative accepts his death as one of the possible outcomes of any pregnancy, and simultaneously puts forth the notion that women, while birthing, remain straddled between this life and the next. Turning back to the modern world, this last decade has seen an increase in popular articles bemoaning the state of maternal mortality rates, particularly in the United States. Fueled by a litany of scholarly studies and public policy papers, popular news forums and magazines alike have published such titles as, there should be a new slide, and you'll have to click through it. So, why are American women dying in childbirth? Al Jazeera 2014. Click again. Maternal death rates are decreasing everywhere but the US, HuffPost 2017. And finally, the US ranks worst in maternal care mortality compared with 10 other developed nations. The attention given to the issue by experts and lay people alike suggests that childbirth in the US is unnecessarily, not inherently dangerous, an idea that would have been bizarre throughout most of history. True, the benefits of modern medicine have lessened the risks associated with childbirth, but ancients knew well what modern people, especially those who have the benefit of access to medical care, rarely acknowledge: that childbearing women linger between life and death, and that the birthing bed, a place of life potentially becomes the grave in an instant. Thank you. And there's the last slide.
Thank you
Yay.
so much, Candace. So we have some time for questions. And we're already in our break time, but as long as we can go to yoga at 1:15 or use that time to do something else, then I think we're okay spilling in a little bit. Andrew, your hand.
That was great, Candace. Thank you. That was well worth the wait. So I'm really glad we got to hear that. I just want to add in one more late dangerous pregnancy story, which is Felicitas.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Right, which may, Ellen Mueller, actually be late, right? Depending on when we actually are dating this text, that actually could be a kind of 4th century text. And what's sort of interesting about that is, it's linked, she then dies, right? So she doesn't die in childbirth, but she dies anyway,
Yes,
which is
right,
a twist on this. And also when it gets interpreted, it goes from being a story, which I think it is in the text, about maternal danger to her virility. So when people talk about it, like Augustine talks about it a lot and other people talk about it, that's what it becomes. So they're almost determined to ignore the context you're laying out, which is that it's very dangerous. It's like a kind of martyrdom to give birth to, well, she gave birth like a man and like fought her way through it and like had a back and forth with the guard. So I think it fits well into the kind of very ambivalent context where people sometimes see this but don't want to see it. That text, but also its kind of afterlife in the 4th, 5th, 6th centuries. So thank you very much.
Oh,
I guess that was more of a comment.
Make note.
I'm going to raise my own hand if that's okay. The privilege of chairing. This was wonderful, Candace. And I have just 2 comments. First, I had to read a lot of those ITS and Polyvagina sections for the source book and found them really, really disturbing and horrifying. And you can just imagine the distress of the situations that are being described. And then also there's lots of descriptions about people who don't do this very well. And you think, well, that's even worse, attaching pregnant women to ladders and bouncing them up and down and so yeah, those texts are very vivid, and putting them into conversation with this particular patient, this episode of this woman, also really makes her own agency in this situation more poignant for me. So I really appreciated the bringing together of those 2, the medical descriptions, the very dramatic ones, and her own self-advocacy in some way. So thank you.
It's also thanks. It's also interesting because it's very clear in the text that sometimes these children are still alive too. Like they're just like, if the baby's too big, and you're like, okay, what does that mean?
Right. Yeah, there's a lot that's implicit, and it doesn't take much imagination to grasp the full horror of the moral dilemma, the carnage and so forth. Yeah. Are there any other questions for Candace? Yes. It's Janet. Sorry, did I get it right?
Joanne, but
I'm sorry, Joanne. I apologize. Yes, go for it.
Wonderful, wonderful lecture. I just loved it. It was way worth the wait. Yes. Just in terms of the baby being too big, I can answer that from personal experience. I was too big, and I broke my mother's tailbone coming out. And if the baby is too large, they do C-sections now to avoid. Yeah, that can be really dangerous if the child is too large for the opening. It's particularly, yes, I'm going to do that. If it gives you any comfort, I have some texts from the ancient world that you might find a little bit more, shall we say, women friendly. One of them is a very wonderful, these are childbirth, they're incantations that are being recited to help in a difficult childbirth. They do a lot of holistic healing. In other words, they try to involve the woman it as well, and the treatment that they're giving to try to ease the birth, to try to get the baby to come out. And then if the lochia haven't come down, which is also a problem, you do things afterwards to get them to come out. So anyway, it describes a woman as if she were a warrior on the field of battle. It makes that direct comparison. So anyway, this is coming from the male. Well, there were midwives normally, but difficult childbirth, they brought in a physician. And anyway, this is from the mouth of a man. And the other as a lament also for a woman who died in childbirth. This is for the woman who died in childbirth. Doesn't say anything about the baby, but it is just the woman who died in childbirth. And it is recited by a man, presumably, or maybe by another woman at the funeral, but it is phrased as her talking and giving how happy she was when she got pregnant because the prospect of having a child, and then how unhappy she was when it turned out that it was not going to be. The birth goddess veiled her face, and that meant she was going to die. It's really heart-wrenching. It's an amazing piece of literature, and it's written as if a woman was, the dead woman was actually reciting it. So I just wanted to share that with you to hopefully cheer you up a little bit.
Jonathan, I saw your hand up as well. Did you want to?
Oh, we're like a minute to yoga. I'll
Okay.
Just maybe another time.
Okay. Well, what we'll do is perhaps the following. I'm going to be directive here. Benedict, are you okay with starting at 1:20 and we do about 10 minutes? Benedict is my master's student who will lead us through some yoga if we want, and with screens off or not, or whatever, whatever you're comfortable with. But between now and 1:30, you have break time. And part of that break can be getting in a bit of a stretch so that we do these conferencey things in a more humane manner. But I'm sure there are other things, pressing needs that need to be taken care of as we've been sitting for a while. And so we'll all come back here and convene for the formal portion of the afternoon at 1:30, and that will be Jonathan Zecker's talk. Okay, I'll be right back, Benedict.
Everybody's body. Yeah. Everyone enjoyed. They were like, it's so dark. They were like, we really appreciate the ancient sources next to the medical text next to the they were like, they were like, yeah, they're done with their session. I think I might change this.
Candace, you're still unmuted.
Really about
Nope. All right.
Like the portrayal of like difficult labor experiences in late ancient like Egyptian. I do Egyptian texts, so late ancient. And the hot happy mess. How's it going?
It's going fine. It sounds like it could be a lovely article.
Yeah. Yeah.
I can't be tamed.
I brought my mat. Are you using a mat? No?
No, I have
Wait, Dulce's right here, baby.
a
Yeah, she's in her favorite spot.
Heidi, you might need to mute Candace. I think she's away from the computer, but her mic's on.
That's what I just did. Sorry about that. Thanks, Jonathan. Yeah. So we'll just be standing or sitting, Benedict?
sitting. So I've prepared a desk sequence in case people don't have a mat. So we're going to do about 10 minutes of desk yoga. Very simple. And if anything doesn't feel good for anyone, just feel free to modify based on how your body is feeling today. There's no pressure to do every posture or kind of go all out.
I want to do a headstand. Just
Oh,
kidding.
great idea.
No,
Get
I'd,
blood
I'd hurt myself if I did that.
Should we wait another 3 minutes or?
You know, anyone who's ready, I think we can start. Yeah.
Okay, sounds good.
And thank you so much, Benedict, for doing this. It's lovely.
It's my pleasure. So we'll begin with a breath exercise. So the hands are going to come underneath the chin. And then you can either follow along right now or watch the first set as I demonstrate. So you're going to inhale. As you inhale through the nose, the elbows come all the way up. And then as you exhale through the mouth, a sound, you tilt your head back and the elbows come to touch. As you inhale again through the nose, the chin drops, the elbows come all the way up. And exhale, head tilts back, elbows come to touch. So again, inhale, elbows come all the way up, fill the lungs with air. And exhale, through the mouth, tilt the head back, elbows come to touch. Inhale, full breath for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and exhale, 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Inhale, one more set. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and exhale, 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Perfect. Exhale, you can release your hands down. Now that we've got some more oxygen in the body, we're going to move to cat-cow pose, but from the desk. So you could place your hands in front of you on your desk, and then you're going to take a deep breath in, and you're going to arch your back, tilt your head back behind you. As you exhale, you're going to arch your back forward. The head comes down towards the belly button. So inhale, modified cow pose. The head tilts back, deep breath. And exhale, you're going to arch the back, look at the belly button. Good. Inhale, looking behind, shining the chest forward. And exhaling, arching the back, bringing the gaze to the belly button. You can keep going like this at your own rhythm, your own pace. Really undulating the spine with each movement. And you can take one more cat and one more cow. And then returning to neutral spine, relax the shoulders down. Inhale, reach the arms up overhead. And your fingers are interlocked. Reach up as high as you can. Straighten the spine. The chin is gently tucked so that the spine is long. And then exhale, reach your hands forward, keeping the fingers interlocked. Just trying to decompress between the shoulders. And then inhale, reach back up. And exhale, reach forward. Again, inhale, reach up. And exhale, reach forward. One more of each. Inhale, reach up. And exhale, reach forward. Good. Relax the hands down. You're going to gently twist in your chair, looking over one shoulder at a time. And then exhaling as you come back through center. Inhaling as you twist to the other side. And then moving from side to side at your own rhythm, at your own pace, gently twisting. Good, one more twist to each side. And then returning back to center, we're going to do a gentle neck stretch. So you're going to inhale and exhale, let your ear fall towards your shoulder. You can either use your hand to guide your head or gravity can do the work for you. Just holding here for a few breaths, allowing the muscles to release. Trying to keep both shoulders relaxed and down. And then when you feel ready, you can gently rock the head forward and all the way over to the other side. Holding here. And then when you feel ready, repeating the cycle at your own pace. Just being mindful that the shoulders stay relaxed. Two more deep breaths as you stretch through the neck.
There, I've put a link in the chat for everybody. This is to a handout. I am not good with PowerPoint on the best of occasions, and I suspect it'll be much worse on Zoom. So that'll be something that if you want to refer to, you can. It contains at least some of the sources I'm working with. Okay, well, sorry, Heidi.
I was just going to tell them the title of.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
Yeah, it is, because I want to say this: Seminal Confessions, Sexual Dreams and Spiritual Diagnosis According to John Cashion. Take it away, Jonathan.
Thanks, Heidi. And thanks everybody for coming. It's really good to see so many of you. Yeah, so the handout's titled, So You've Had a Wet Dream. And this is going to be a paper that either speaks very deeply to your experience or not at all. We'll know very quickly. But it's also a very small glimpse into a much larger project on spiritual direction in early Byzantine monastic texts as a medical art. And so feedback is much appreciated and excited to hear what you think. So the significance of dreams was, in antiquity, a truth universally acknowledged. Dispute lay in the details. Dreams could be thought to arise from the soul's operations or from their suppression, from divine or daimonic incursions, even from particles striking the body. Across these different ideologies, dreams could tell the future, command an action, offer a prescription, or even for the most skeptical and naturalistic like Aristotle, at least indicate the body's internal state or foretell incipient illness. Christian ascetics participated in these same discourses of dreaming, but evaluated dream sources rather differently and so found rather different significance in dreams. So Evagrius Ponticus, one of those foremost, most famous ascetic writers, argued that the emotional quality of dream imagery, whether it aroused desire, terror, or self-congratulation, indicated which part of the tripartite soul was malfunctioning, while its clarity indicated how deeply sick the dreamer might be. He makes dreams diagnostic, not of physical ailment, but of psychological, affective, and moral illness. And here we come back to Ellen's earlier question about whether we're talking about medical metaphors or an epistemological conflation or collapse. And I think it's we'll just kind of carry that question through this study as well. So Evagrius, within that framework, is incredulous of divine dreams. He's quite worried about demonic ones, and he's open to those inspired by angels or by a healthy soul. His ambivalence toward dreams, as well as his reliance on them as a diagnostic indicator, is echoed by writers like Diaticus of Photiki, Mark the Solitary, John of Carpathos, and my favorite, John Climacus. Now, another of Evagrius's disciples, or at least readers, people interested in him and inspired by him, John Cassian, takes a different tack. For Cassian, all dreams are lying images and illusions. Yet he obsessed over a kind that did not interest Evagrius and which was not generally held to be particularly significant: the wet dream. Now, in this essay, we will explore Cassian's incorporation of wet dreams into what we might call a medical framework of spiritual direction. And this framework is laid out both semantically and logically. That is, he uses a lot of medical language to describe it, but also I would say he's doing things in an order and approach that was inspired by medicine, technical medicine. So Cassian himself was a monastic and polemical theologian of the early 5th century, whose life was far more eventful than he would have liked. Now, originally from Dacia, he was tonsured a monk in Syria and later traveled to Egypt with his friend Germanus to visit the holy men of Scetis, Nitria, and elsewhere. Decades later, he distilled his version of Egyptian practices and the Evagrian psychology of the 8 thoughts into his institutes, an instructional and regulative manual aimed at monks in Gaul. Later, still, he reimagined his travels and conversations into a vast and compendious set of 24 conferences, which is where we're going to really be working today. In both collections, though, Cassian rejects the truth of dreams, but raises the issue of wet dreams time and again. He uses them as diagnostic signs to discover the mental and physical habits, the memories and dispositions which lie behind them. Now, admittedly, scholars have spilled a good deal of ink over the spilling of semen in Cassian's writings. I hope that's the worst pun I make today, but I make no promises. But generally, they've either followed Foucault in emphasizing an apparent depth to the monastic self and its shrinkage through obedience, okay, another pun, or they have focused on the consequences wet dreams have for monks' canonical status, that is, can they receive communion? Cassian, though, is only tangentially interested in whether monks take communion, though he thinks they should, if they can. And I think actually Nikki Kazumi Clements has recently critiqued this aspect of Foucault's analysis of Cassian sufficiently. So I'm going to kind of leave both of those aside today, and I'm just going to drill down into what I think is more the medical framework for Cassian's thinking, though I'm, again, happy to talk about it later. So we're going to show how unruly oniric phenomena became part of the diagnosis and therapy of monastic bodies in search of chastity. Now, Cassian develops his singularly dismissive account of dreams using language and resources available from late antique philosophical medical conversations. Particularly relevant are Aristotle's theories and a Galenic treatise on dream diagnosis. In his Parva Naturalia, Aristotle argued that dreams are echoes of sense perception in the imagination, phantasmata, running loose while the common sense is impaired by sleep. Oniric images are susceptible to influence from other pathi, such as anger and love, so that if the soul is already moved by strong emotions, then the movements of lingering perception will be, as it were, colored by them. Angry people dream about violence and lovers dream of their beloved. The phantasmata that beget dreams are in principle no different from those that fill the memory, though their arousal differs. Whereas memories are at least usually voluntary, recalled through a process that moves by inference, dreams come when the intellectual faculty is at rest. They are produced by sense perception's lingering effects in the soul and are, if anything, more physiologically determined than memories. Thus, Aristotle flatly denies any divine origin to dreams, but freely admits that they may indicate present or incipient somatic states. Now, much later, and there's a lot in between that I'm going to skip for time, but you have a bit more in your handout on pages 2 and 3 of, especially page 2, Theories of Dream Origins. Galen, or a later editor offering an epitome of the Galenic view of dreams, most likely, also equates dreams, enhypnia, with mental images, phantasiae. However, here, Galen, or pseudo-Galen, differs from Aristotle in 2 ways: dream source and dream production. As to source, he allows 4 possibilities. They reflect bodily dispositions, diatheses. They come from, quote, what we continually do during the day, or what we have thought about, or they show something prophetically. The latter may be divine or daimonic in origin, but Galen describes production of the first 3 categories, that is the bodily or the mental or the memorial. Thus, he says, it is probable that during sleep, the soul descends into the depths of the body and, being withdrawn from external objects of sense, perceives in accordance with the body's disposition, diathesis. While of all things it desires, it has an image of them as though it already obtained them. In Freudian terms, dreams are wishes fulfilled. Now, the description of the soul here recalls the Hippocratic on regimen 4 on dreams, but instead of that treatise's circuits of flesh in the microcosmic world, Galen refers us to disposition, by which he intends the body's humoral balance. It's crasis. Whatever is not simply wish fulfillment in dreams results from the latter, and this explains their diagnostic significance. He says, what sick people see and seem to do in dreams often reveals to us the lack, the excess, and the quality of the humors. Now, physicians of late antiquity follow texts like this, as well as very similar sentiments in Rufus of Ephesus's Medical Questions, in correlating dream imagery, especially color, with humoral dispositions. Medical usage codes the seemingly liminal and unruly psychic phenomena of dreams to the stable map of a medical subject. And I hear now echoes of Chris's paper. The challenge, signaled already, lies in disambiguating the sources and therefore whether and how a dream is diagnostically significant. Now, closely allied to the question of dreams were those surrounding seminal emissions, and the medical literature expounds the theories of their origin and very commonly their prevention. Late antique doctors generally discuss these in the same sections as they discuss priapism, satyriasis, and other matters of sexual behavior or bodily resistance to socially derived norms of sexual behavior. Sex was an activity over which, or about which the ancients had lots of feelings, none of which are divorceable from the assumptions or positions they held or thought they held or the genders they intended to perform. But within these constraints, medical literature generally seeks a physiological cause and response to bodily phenomena. To the extent that seminal emissions concern physicians, it is more the loss of vital spirit, the pneuma psychikon, in semen that most worries them. The dreams that accompany ejaculation are interesting only as ancillary to the emission itself, and even then they're pretty rarely discussed. So whence arise nocturnal emissions? And here I think also page 2 of your handout, if you like. Caelius Aurelianus, through whose work scholars have generally approached Cassian's medical language, discusses seminal emissions, seminis lapsus, in context of somni venerii, sexual dreams, by which he translates the Greek term oneurogmos, which does not mean sexual dream. He argues that the somnus venereus is a name, quote, taken from the symptom, the phenomenon, insofar as the dream by its provoking it leads to a sexual outcome. That is, Caelius's account anchors nocturnal emissions in sexual dreams. They are accompanied always by what he calls visa venerea, sexual sights. In terms of dream production, Caelius seems to follow a basically Aristotelian model. He says that sick individuals suffering from somni venerii ought, quote, first and foremost, to shift mental images from the ideal of sexual intercourse, and having turned to external considerations, to imply them instead elsewhere. Since the sick easily cultivate by corresponding movements the impressions they receive while awake in dream images toward actions, it's a fun bit of syntax, and therefore their body is troubled by the shaking of semen. Dreams consist then in mental images lingering over from waking meditations. If someone thinks much about sex during the day, especially if they're sick, they're likely to dream about it at night and likely to finish the deed in thought. Now, Other physicians, though, suggest that causation works in an opposite direction. Most remedies for nocturnal emissions rely less on alteration to mental habits than dietetic and even pharmacological interventions. Rufus of Ephesus states flatly that, quote, the ejaculatory dream is set in motion by the heat of the genitals, end quote. Certainly, it's wise to avoid sexual thoughts, he says, but end seminal emissions without also lying on one's side, without fasting before bed, without a drier and colder diet devoid of phlegmatic and flatulent foods. One finds similar dietetic and pharmacological advice across late antique medical literature, including the famous application of lead plates. I keep wanting to say lead pipes to the genitals, but that sounds worse. Lead plates. Popular, mentioned by Cassian, although also rejected by Cassian for reasons we can come back to. One does not, however, find much on mental habits beyond the bare suggestion just to avoid sexual thoughts. Now, the range of therapeutic techniques shows quite clearly that physicians, including the Christian ones later, because they just repeat the same therapies, thought about sexual dreams and seminal emissions in terms of humoral imbalance and seminal production. Their concern was with suppressing the emission of semen because that weakens the body, or because an increase in emissions may portend melancholia or mania. The dreams themselves are irrelevant. Thus, in a statement that Christian physicians and dream interpreters could easily echo, Galen says simply, men full of semen dream of sex. Now, if we turn this lens on Cassian, somebody should be clocking how many times I've said semen in this paper, because it's beginning to worry me. A lot, yeah, it's a lot. Turning this lens on Cassian, we can see how indebted he is to these theories and therapeutic discussions, but we can also glimpse how much his theological commitments require their modification. Though his interest in sexual dreams spans the entirety of his monastic writings, we're going to read retrospectively, beginning with the end, with the 22nd conference of Abba Theonas on seminal emissions. And here, Cassian begins at the end, when monks awake to find themselves splattered with an emission of natural fluids, humorum naturalium egestione respersos. Monks' experience of sexual dreams is ineluctably bodily, retrospective, and begins with a physical residue and the revulsion it inspires. While Theonas does speak once of humoris naturalis, he also, like Abba Chiramon in the 12th conference on chastity, more frequently calls semen the obscenus liquor or the obscenus humor, the vile and disgusting liquid. And Cassian often refers to its emission as a conluio, as sewage. But the emissions themselves, distasteful though they clearly are to him, or no, not conluio, I'm sorry, conluium. Anyway, as distasteful though they are, they don't belong to the realm of moral responsibility. Cassian is certain that emissions will take place in most adult males, whatever their level of chastity or integrity, their physical regimen, and their mental habit. The emission's inescapable reality, however, cues self-reflection through self-disclosure. As Cassian says, a sexual illusio, an illusory dream, is an indicative sign of sinful desire hidden deep within a person. It is an indicium. These signs are to be read by the elders of the monastic community, whom Cassian describes as spiritual physicians, spiritualis medici, who can, thanks to long experience, diagnose causes and prescribe medical advice, medicabile consilium, and therapies, ReMeDHe, to dreamers. So, Cassian, in the person of Abba Theonas, suggests that this is done by discerning the three possible sources of nocturnal emissions and the dreams behind them. He says this disturbance has a triple cause. Either an overflow builds up from excess of foods, or it escapes through carelessness of mind, or it is provoked by our mocking enemy's ambushes. The first cause is bodily, the second mental, the third demonic, no longer daimonic. Theonas will then explain that if the emission is suffered due to a bodily or mental cause, it's culpable. If due to a demonic attack, not culpable. He provides the following criteria for determining if emission is demonic in origin. He says, our enemy pollutes us without any fleshly itching or mental consent, and not through an illusion of some mental image, but by a simple emission of that fluid. That is to say, one can blame demons only when the emission is dreamless, something not envisioned by Kailes and other physicians. And only in similar circumstances could it be called a simple bodily movement and nothing more. This is something unforeseen by other physicians, but demanded, I think, by Cassian's and before him Evagrius's demonology. Now, when dreams do accompany emissions, the production of images correlates to the monk's morally and spiritually judicable behavior. As to the first cause, the excess of fluids that accrues not only necessitates an image, not only necessitates an emission, but an image. So in the second conference, Abba Moses explains that proper fasting prevents a buildup of fluid. Which would otherwise accrue and be emitted due to what he calls a natural law of the body. But this natural law has mental effects, since, as Theonos remarks, when there is no repletion in the matter of eating, and ejaculation, and so also an illusion in Lucio, will disturb sleepers more infrequently and not so strongly, because an emission does not so much come from the imagination, the imaginatio, as the imagination comes from an excess of fluid. Cassian merely repeats Galenic medical wisdom in claiming that bodily states influence mental ones, and that an imbalance, in this case an excess of humoris, can set the imaginatio into motion and create illusiones, even as it spurs emissions. But this physical cause has an equally physical, and in Cassian's text, morally inflected therapy in a modified regimen of fasting. The second cause is mental carelessness, which is a bit more problematic. Theonos explains that through negligentia, not only does the multiform wandering of thoughts, something that Cassian worries about very much, break impudently and frivolously into the mind's inmost place, but also the seeds of all one's former passions remain in the mind. So long, he continues, as those seeds remain, tantalizing mental images will persist along with nocturnal emissions. Such emissions are accompanied by dreams whose source then lies in the memory. And here we're back with Aristotle, but in a new and problematic way. In the 12th conference, Abba Kairamon says of such tantalizing illusions that each person is tempted, even while asleep, according to how he behaves and thinks while awake. Sexual dreams take shape according to the thoughts that a monk has previously entertained, whether that day or even longer before. And even these monks who were once married have what Cassian says are filthier and more vivid dreams than virgin monks, but even the latter have considered sexual acts, and so their dreams are as hazy as their conceptions. When it is a matter of memory, then, Cassian prescribes a mental diet of meditatio on scripture and psalm-based prayer to be digested, his metaphor, in the memory, an analog to the regimen of fasting. But of course, the beginning of all this remains the distasteful reality of ejaculation, through which the body confesses for the dreamer and forces him to confront the experience that lies behind it. Unlike Evagrius, who approaches dreams by disambiguating their imagery, Cassian is concerned with disambiguating their physical residue. Unlike physicians, he is not interested in suppressing the ejaculation. In fact, he rejects the notion of lead plates because they wouldn't cure the cause, but rather encountering the cause through an analysis of the experience of dream. Wet dreams implicate the soul's interdependence with the body, and this psychophysiological framework enables Cassian to make them a diagnostic tool for accessing mental and physical habits which otherwise lie hidden in the past, and for turning monks to appropriate therapies in the future. Yet, for Cassian, nocturnal emissions are not something sloughed off as monks attain to purity of heart. They are an inescapable fact of embodied existence. Thus, he adduces a fourth cause, one I have not mentioned, pride. Some monks begin to believe that they have shed their flesh and its laws. These monks can be sure of a wet dream to remind them that they still bear a body. The only cure then is humility and the acceptance that it is not by effort and desire alone, but always, and this is very important to Cassian, by the grace of God that the monk can attain to chastity. And chastity is always and necessarily deficient precisely by the measure of semen lost in wet dreams. For Cassian, these mark the frontiers of will and desire and call for disclosure, for diagnosis, and for therapy within the hierarchical relationships of a monastic community. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Yeah, Molly's right. Reading Cassian takes you right down the rabbit hole back to middle school, and it's not fun.
Middle school youth group.
Oh, well, that's not fun either.
Oh, sounds like there are some analogs between your youth group and mine, Molly. Anyway, let's turn to questions. Does anybody have a question? I see, Joanne, your hand is up, but I think it's from earlier. Oh, and you're muted.
If you want, we can talk about things not in the paper, like the hopeless gendering of chastity in Cassian. This is clearly about male bodies, and one wonders what women are supposed to do or think.
I was wondering, sorry, I was wondering about the relationship between another male issue, and that's masturbation. To what extent is the seminal, these wet dreams and so forth, and masturbation, how does that kind of complex play out?
Yeah, Cassian doesn't talk a whole lot about masturbation. It is, funnily enough, I'm trying to think if it's really connected in all the physicians I've got in there. It's not closely connected, like in terms of, does masturbation lead to an increase or decrease in nocturnal emissions? It's not really there in Cassian. Other monastic authors obviously do talk about masturbation, and they are quite horrified by it. Climacus says it's the secret death that he dares not even speak of, which seems a little excessive to me.
I should tell you a story of a friend of mine who was educated in a monastic setting. Anyway, one of his professors said, well, masturbation, you're going to do it. So learn the first 3 chapters of the Summa and then do it. Using it as a tool to memorizing all the bits in Latin you have to memorize.
That's an interesting based motivational system. Heidi, I see you have your hand up too.
Yes, I was wondering if I could ask about the demons piece. So
yeah,
if I heard you properly in Cassian, demons can cause you to have a nocturnal emission, but they cannot create dreams?
Yeah, that's what's really interesting. He does not seem to allow for that possibility, which is different from like Evagrius and a lot of other authors,
right.
Where the demons.
That's a real limitation on the power of demons to interact with the human mind or psyche.
So okay. So if I could take a broader scope, I think it is and it isn't, because, when Evagrius asks this, he's like, well, how do the demons get things going? He says, well, they stir up the memory, because memories tend to be encoded with the passions that one felt during the experience, and probably are reconsolidated every time you remember, being angry at someone, you're going to get angry again. Yeah. And so he says, the demons likely stir up the memory, which they can do through kind of, or they stir the passion that might stir the memory that might stir the passion, but they don't create dreams out of nothing, out of thin air. They do so by kind of operating on pre-existing material in the monastic body and soul. And so Cassian might very well allow for that. But when it comes to wet dreams, he is keen to show that if the demons are really responsible and the monk bears no responsibility himself, then he would not have had a dream. If he has a dream, then there's something at work in him that is more than just the demons at work on him. So he might allow for them stirring up memories, but if so, then we're kind of back to one of the other issues, and we still have to work on it. If it's purely demonic in origin, then it's all they can do is work on the body. They can't work directly on the soul. And that's true kind of more broadly for Cassian as well, that they kind of require an organic interface, if that makes sense.
And this is just as a final comment, I'm just trying to think of all the different kinds of diagnostic conversations that somebody like Cassian is having with his monks, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. What's the checklist?
And so on page 4 of the handout, really, that checklist is basically just Conference 22, Section 6, subsections 1 through 7. This monk comes to the elders and is worried about whether he should take communion because he's been having these dreams. And so they actually start, is it cause 1? No. Is it cause 2? No, it's got to be cause 3. Demons, not your fault. Take communion, right? And all along the way, I mean, it really works like a flow chart.
A wet dream flow chart.
A wet dream flow chart. That's right.
That's the title of your next paper, Jonathan. Okay, I will desist and hand things over to Molly.
So I can't help but think that there's a bit of a don't think about the elephant problem in the premise behind this therapeutic approach, at least on the mental end of this. Do they seem to be wrestling with or aware of the problem of trying not to think about the thing that you're now thinking about not thinking about?
Yeah.
Is that what the demon is for?
Okay, so that's a great question. I'm going to say I don't think it's what the demon is for, but it's actually, so this is where a lot of what I do now is so inspired by Mary Carruthers' work on memory, because it's not about not thinking about things, it's about thinking about other things. And so this is why Cassian is all about meditatio, right? It's all about reading and memorizing and reciting scripture. And then for prayer, you know, he doesn't even really suggest that that should be done extemporaneously out of your own thoughts. For that, you use the Psalms, and you learn to take on the dispositions, the adfectus of the Psalms. And so you begin to refill your memory with new content. And so actually he expresses at one point concern. He says, you know, beginners really should be careful what they read in scripture, because some stories in scripture might get naughty thoughts going. And you have to have enough experience to know how to distance yourself even from that. So meditatio also has kind of stages of development that correspond to abilities learned through previous meditatio. So I think he's actually, though he never says it, keenly aware of the don't think about the elephant problem. It's about refilling, digesting new material into the memory. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great point.
Joanne, before I go to you, Brenda has communicated in the chat with me and we haven't heard from her, so I want to give her a chance.
Hi, thank you. I'm sorry. Sorry, I wasn't able to put I'm not able to put my little blue hand up. I'm not sure why that is, but thank you for calling on me. My question actually was connected to what Molly had just asked about, that if you're not thinking about, what then are you thinking about, and the organization of texts within these texts that are required for monks to be meditating on, because of course, one approach to a particular contemplative text can lead an individual in one direction, while the same text can leave an individual in another. So I bet there's some interesting taxonomies that you could explore with those particular contemplative texts. But you know, the other thing I wanted to say, which is much less important, is I can't believe that someone has actually out-genitaled me in an academic presentation. So Jonathan, I think I have to hand the trophy over to you for, yeah.
Would you be willing to say that it was a baller move?
It was a baller move.
Thank you, Brenda.
My inner 12-year-old just loved it. So it, you know, and I have to tell you, I have to rely on the subtitles, and they're not always accurate, and that it makes it a lot more fun. Thanks.
Brenda.
Yes, and then Joanne.
I just wanted to make a quick suggestion. In terms of the question of whether or not you have demonic possession going on, there's a really be interesting to compare. So when you get down to the age of the witch burnings, where they're trying to decide whether the person is just sort of off in the head, or there's a whole range of things they look for and questions they ask and so forth. And it would be, I think, somewhat interesting to go after the demon problem by taking a look at how they're believed to behave in other sort of contexts, shall we say, other than seminal emission. And the other thing I wanted to quickly point it out is what's interesting about this idea of being weakened by this thing. The birth control in India was exceedingly successful when they did vasectomies as opposed to like birth control pills or whatever, because they also believe that you have a certain number of children in you and that you are weakened progressively with each ejaculation. So it's just sort of an interesting thing where there are some other people who have thought the same way. That might be kind of interesting to look into. But
Yep.
anyway, yeah.
Appreciated both suggestions. And in fact, I mean, the issue of possession and more generally, I guess, interaction with demons,
right,
is the topic of the 7th conference, as it happens. It's
Okay.
quite a fascinating one.
Okay, so you can compare it directly with him, you know, what
yeah.
he does on that issue as opposed to what happens later. But yeah, okay, very good.
Yeah.
Susan, you have your hand up.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jonathan. I was more curious. This is fascinating, but it made me think, made me aware of an absence, and it may be an absence in my knowledge, but I wonder if it's an absence that's there for a reason. Because I've looked so much at dream incubation texts, and I actually have not seen much on wet dreams in dream incubation texts. And I'm wondering, are they there? I mean, I'm thinking Artemius, Aristides, you know, Sophronius, other tech, Cosmas and Damian. There's someone who's just come out with a book on dream incubation as well. I'm just wondering if that would be a fruitful direction for sort of curiosity in this topic.
Boy, I'm going to have to say yes. I don't know dream incubation text very well, though. Yeah, I can't think of anything. No, Brenda might have something there, but that is interesting. One thing that does come to mind is that's sort of an intentional dreaming, if one can call it that. It's an attempt at intentional dreaming, and so that might be somewhat different. These seem to be. But I don't know. You know what? I'll just say that's a great suggestion, and I'm going to have to think about it.
Because the dreams that are described do not all sound pleasant to those who are dreaming. So,
right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, and you know, I guess one point of comparison that I do know, Artemidorus. You know, I mean, that book is full of some fairly unnerving sexual situations. With no comment, almost no comment whatsoever on a physical outcome, and obviously no interest in moralizing them. I mean, I think this is one of those points where Foucault's analysis is so good. You know, they're just reinstantiating the social world in the dreamscape. And so what really matters is if you're performing the right role. But beyond that, who cares if you're having sex with your mother? That's all good. Just a good wheat harvest. You're like, oh, okay. Whereas Cassian, you know, it's funny, he doesn't care a whit about what you see in the dream. It's all a lie, which is a funny thought. The only thing that matters is this physical outcome, and it's so at odds with a lot of other dream literature, even with other Christian literature. Nemesius, you know, for example, will say, you know, there's only one kind of proper real divination, and that's dream divination, because we know from Joseph and the Gospel of Matthew, and Cassian deliberately avoids all of those passages. When he talks about Joseph, he never once talks about Joseph's dream interpretation. So the signs and symbols of dreams are pushed to one side so that he can focus entirely on this one thing that other people found much less interesting because it didn't tell you anything. It wasn't significant, either of the future or anything else, or of what you should do. So one thought that does come to mind, and then I'll wrap up my rambling response, is that you might not have this reported in dream incubations because what matters is the content of the dream, not what happens afterward. You know, that even if one did have a nocturnal emission as part of it, that's not relevant. What matters is the imagery in the dream and how that's interpreted. Might be one, but I don't know. I'm gonna think about that more. Thanks, Susan.
So what I'd like to do is first thank Jonathan, and then also thank all three of our presenters for excellent papers. We have some time, we always had this time, it's just been moved up half an hour, to have a larger discussion with all of our presenters. The way I would like to proceed, if that's all right with everyone, is first see if there are some connections that our three presenters would like to make with each other, and with the papers and conversations. So are there things that you see in each other's papers that you might want to focus on a bit as a way of framing our conversation. I see there are, gender dimensions between Candace's and Jonathan's papers. I think that in terms of the monastic regimens, as a kind of medical discourse, and so forth, those are connections between Jonathan and Chris's papers, but those are just my most superficial ways of making connections. I'm sure others can do it better and more deeply. So I'll turn things over first to see if Chris, Candace, or Jonathan have anything they want to say to each other or ask each other or highlight. And then we can move out from there to the larger group to make those kinds of connections, or also ask lingering ones that we didn't get a chance to. So Chris, I see you.
I just with regards to Jonathan's paper and with dreams, and I've been thinking about this idea in my own paper, although I didn't mention it, that dreams are a little tricky, because what I try to say in my paper is that, you've got this extensive mapping of the individual subject in these monastic handbooks. And through these practices, of course, like you would have with Cassian and others, where they have these sort of very intense discussions, and it's type of trying to map out and make sense of that which is ambiguous and that we cannot see. But dreams are particularly problematic for this framework, because they tend to sort of dwell in a liminal space between body and, even though they sort of reside in the soul perhaps, but then you've got these emissions that are sort of very bodily. So dreams are problematic for these authors, because they almost occupy like a liminal space between body, soul, and it's a little difficult for them to grasp. It's so what I'm actually saying, how it connects my paper and yours, at least how I see how your paper helps me to think better about things, is that these things that they speak about, like dreams, it's difficult to map. It's difficult to map, it's difficult to place, and that's what makes it so curious. So that would be an interesting point to explore, I think, which I haven't done in detail, but it's something that I still need to do in the paper as well. So thanks for your paper.
No, thanks, Chris. I mean, just to kind of come in on that, and then I want to connect this, I think, also with Candace's paper, because I think there is the mapping the liminal is an interesting point of continuity, because even these descriptions of well, I think a lot of what we find in terms of trying to categorize types of dream in people like Herophilus of Alexandria, or later kind of compilatory literature, references to Pseudo-Galen and Aetius. I mean, those are all encyclopedias of opinions, right? Attempting to map out a world in ways that I think are really consonant with what you're describing, Chris. And dreams occupy an important place because they're liminal. They're all the more in need of discipline, being pinned to a stable grid, where you can make sense of them and say, okay, you saw this, it came from this, it means this, and being able to sort those out is something I think important to a lot of different kinds of authors, of which the Christian monastics are just kind of one example. But I mean, that trying to pin down the liminal. I mean, Candace, I don't know if you saw that at work. I mean, to me, that seems a lot like what I was hearing in your paper as well. This state between life and death, and how to make sense of it in a way that isn't just giving up on it. I don't know. What does that sound right to you, or does that seem left field?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's interesting that, like, in writing things, we attempt to concretize what may in fact be what something in fact not be able to be, right? We're trying to, as you point out, make limits or explain limits, or make solid something that is kind of ephemeral and not like able to touch. And I think that's kind of what's definitely happening in my text, in the sense that they are attempting to navigate this weird space, especially with women and children. One of the things I didn't mention, but I probably should, if when I take this is that like children themselves are often thought to be babies as they're being born are thought to be in this also weird liminal position, like they're very close to the dead, but they're not yet alive. And so like there's this weird, there's these ways in which both the mother and the child figure in these texts are trying to like are thought to be in this line. And then on the other side of that is that most of our authors, for better or for worse, are men, right? And so like they are not involved in the childbirthing bed in antiquity unless they are doctors, unless you know, maybe they're really strange and they're, you know, stay in the home while the like they only see the consequences, like the end parts, not the middle. So that's the other thing. It's like they are also imagining what these moments look like because they know they end badly all the time, but they're not necessarily involved in that part.
Are there any other connections that folks want to make? Christy.
So I have a comment, but it kind of is a connection, but maybe not. So I hope you'll just forgive me. I wanted to go back to Chris's paper, and I've been thinking about Ellen's point and your response, Chris, of what when this discourse is metaphor and when it's meant to be more than metaphor. And I actually had a different thought, and that thought was, when we want to describe this kind of work, whether it's encyclopedizing, which was a new word to me, and it's a really hard word to say out loud, and when it's discourse, and when it's I was actually more interested in when it's you use language of conquest and colonization and imperializing discourse. And I'm actually more interested in that way of classifying the discourse. Because I think when I think power being behind it, so there's a subject formation, a subject construction, but then there's also force. And I actually think that some of the heresiological texts are actually close because they don't have force, because patients are constantly unruly and not following instructions and beating up their physicians and kicking them out of the house. And, you know, there's all of that. In the same way that the church is having to deal with the disobedience and the unruliness of you know, Christians who are reading texts that they're not supposed to be reading, or they're engaging in practices that they're not supposed to, you know. So I actually thought that the medical frame works a lot better with the heresiological frame than imperial frames, because of that lack of enforcement. And so that's something I would just like, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. But I also thought that the point you made about the speaking, the enunciation of the medical discourse is itself the therapy. I thought that was a really significant distinction that I just want to say yes to that. I agree with that. When I was listening to the monastic papers, I was thinking, but Christianizing discourses also involves practices. And so I'm also thinking about, it's not just words, it's not just the enunciation. So I wanted more of that. I wanted to hear more of what you thought about that. And then also not just discourse and practice, but also relationships. I think that there's a way in which the authors of these encyclopedias, priests, other leaders, Christian leaders, are setting themselves up as a physician in relation to Christian subjects that are occupying the role of the idealized patient. And so I think there's something to there about the sort of relationship that is being imagined or figured So I do think that you're right. I think that the medical actually is doing a lot more work. I'm just not totally convinced that the imperial, the conquest, the colonizing, that stuff is helping you so much. But maybe I missed something, or maybe you could say a little bit more about what work you think that's doing.
Should I answer that, Heidi, or do we want to?
Please do. I think Christy
Thanks.
would be disappointed if you didn't.
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, that's great. Thank you very much. I think, yeah, I mean, perhaps if I speak about imperializing discourse, I think what I have in mind is sort of this very specific ordering of society into what is perceived as being acceptable and pathological. And I think, and the way I'm sort of informed by Todd Bazon's work on this stuff, because he takes that approach, and I still think that the type of ordering, the type of cataloging of these identities, and simply, as I said, simply naming them is already a form of power that is exercised over these individuals. We see it with so many of those groups. I mean, in Epiphanius, I mean, there are groups that I think those people, who, if they existed, some of these groups, because that's another question, but let's say some of them did exist. I sometimes want to hope that there are historical realities behind some of these texts just to make me feel better, but maybe I shouldn't. But I think if you know, he names some of them like the Cainites but I think if you spoke with those people, got in a time machine, they would probably not have realized that they are being referenced by these names. So the naming is doing something. I think so the idea that naming in ancient thought is a form of domination. This is something I sort of tried to show in my first book on slavery. So that was my angle into it. Although I do hear what you're saying about the idea that they're sort of, you know, medicine, you know, it's the heresiological stuff is closer to medicine because there's less force. But naming is a very forceful act if you're not doing it yourself.
Yeah, and I think you get the naming out of medicine too. You get the classification, the categorization, the pathology. So I guess I'm just wondering, why do you need to go to the imperial as opposed to just using medical? Well, because I think you get it, you already get it out of the
Well, I mean, I'm interested in power and imperiality, because I think medicine has this link to imperiality, you know, and to these larger power institutions, I think, and they are maybe not as pronounced as we have today. But I mean, if you live in South Africa, if you live in South Africa, for instance, you are very acutely aware of the haves and the have-nots, those who have power and don't, when you view it through the eyes of medicine and the medical system and medical institutions. And we are particularly seeing it now in this time of the pandemic, you know, where new classifications, new discourses are being formed every day. So I hear what you're saying, and it's a valid point that perhaps I don't need the imperiality for the argument, but I proceed to say that there is a responsibility for me to take it further to imperial power discourses. That is sort of my take on it. You know, I would have to see whether it works or not, but I think something bigger is happening here with this ordering of knowledge and stuff. So yeah, I don't want to take up too much airtime from other speakers, but that would be my sort of response to that. And then just the final thing that you mentioned about practices, absolutely. I fully agree with you. Of course, words are practices as well, aren't they? And the speaking itself is a practice. I mean, particularly in the context of homilies, particularly in the context of amulets. You know, those aspects tend to overlap, but thanks. Great points, which will challenge me to develop the paper further. As always, Christy, thanks.
Are there any?
Would it be okay if I kind of
Oh,
came in
yeah.
on that a little bit?
Yep.
I mean, I'm also very interested in this, in these kinds of things, Chris and Christy, and thinking about even the language of imperializing can itself become kind of a totalizing language, as though the only people who were able to affect anything were those imposing from above. You know, the heresiologist who classifies. But, you know, I tend to, you know, drop my own French name here. I tend to follow Desserteau in seeing a lot more pushback from the unruly through tactics, through finding the holes in the system and exploiting them. And so I wonder, you know, not only I think we see patients, at least we see ones like Elias Aristides doing this, kind of pushing back on those who would tell him what he is and saying, no, I know better than you. Now, I know he's an exceptional example. I don't universalize from him, but I do wonder if in the absence of a kind of state-run system to enforce this kind of thing, medicine does allow for a lot more give and take between the strategies of those who might have power and the tactics of those who might otherwise not have power. And so that you see more of a fluid situation, in which case the language of naming and of classification, you begin to wonder who it's for, right? Who is listening or being talked to in these heresiological or medical encyclopedic texts? Is it the people being classified, or is it just others who would like to see themselves in the same position? You know, the other physicians and their patients are like, well, you know, you call it what you want to, but you know, it's for the physician. It's not for the patient. It's for the heresiologist, not for the heretic. And so I wonder if we could see more fluidity along the lines of what Christy's saying, still within this framework that you're developing, because I do think it's very interesting to see.
Molly?
I'd like to piggyback on what Jonathan and Chris are saying here, and this is coming out of my wheelhouse, which is Pliny the Elder. This isn't just a one-way street, as Jonathan eloquently points out. Oh gosh, now you're gonna fight? Sorry. New cat, they don't like each other. What was I saying? Goddamn. All right, yes. So you have these conflicting spheres of power doing battle over, you know, is it Pliny the Elder and the Roman establishment who get to say what is ethical and unethical in medicine, or is it the medical establishment that gets to establish that? You know, can you ask for money or can you not ask for money? There are all of these locations of contested power within these independent but interlocking spheres. And one of the things that stands out with Pliny the Elder in particular is that, as most people in a place of privilege do, he's kind of blind to the damage he's doing as he's trying to take pot shots at evil Greek physicians that are coming for your wife and your wallet. I don't know if any of this is helpful, but I do really like your imperialism bent. I think it creates a continuity with existing conversations about encyclopedic traditions in the pre-late antique, or what do we call the pre-late antique? Classical, thank you. So I like it, keep it, it's cool. But that's very biased, of course, because Plinianists never shut up about this.
Just as a side note, Molly, I like the pre-late antique world as a way of decentering the classical. I think we should start referring to it that way as late antique historians. Put Pliny in his place. Joanne, yes, go ahead.
I think it might be interesting to ask the question of, yes, naming gains control and power, but what are you controlling and what are you gaining power over? That it's rather different naming people slaves or calling them heretics or whatever. That's one thing. But the other thing is, of course, gaining control of diseases that you're trying to cure. It's why you give names to diseases and names to plants so that you can recognize them and you can use them in medicine. That's a form of control and of power. And this is nothing particularly to do with any kind of well, empires as opposed to kings, as opposed to freedom and democracy or whatever. It's just a form of control over something that actually is of human benefit to be controlled. And having a non-controlled situation would actually be quite terrible. If you didn't have a name that allowed you to go after something, to recognize it, a definition of what that name meant, to recognize something, how would you devise a cure for it? So in the ancient Near East, which I bring up all the time, you have what you might see, or what you do from this paradigm see, as sort of competing systems. There are plant taxonomies. They call them technomy, but that's not correct. What they are is there are local plant taxonomies that differ from the plant taxonomy of the person who was normally delivering the medicine. Okay, so his reaction to this is what? You have a whole set of books whose design is to tell you how to recognize that what you call X, if you go to a local drug market and the locals have it there by their name, what it is. So it gives the name of the plant in like 5 languages that were current at the time. They had no, and they're different, clearly different classinomic systems, because you have 2 names for what would be the same plant in the doctor's, let's say, classification system, and vice versa. So sometimes there are 3 or 4 popular names for the same plant. Other cases, you have 2 popular names for whatever the vice versa is, sorry. So yeah, you have these other systems, people, and look at within our own scientific tradition, there's 2 traditions of naming plants that are somewhat in competition with one another, but where do you assign the imperial project to either of them? And as I said, they are neither done by government. So I think the need to name and to classify is a basic human need to understand and deal with the world around them. It allows them a control, which everybody needs, over their natural environment. And well, that some people feel a need for over other people, but that can go into the sinister very quickly. But I'm not sure I would like to include naming diseases and naming plants in that category. Okay, so I just wanted to put that out there.
Can I?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, go ahead, Chris. You have.
Just brief response to that. No, of course, I mean, I don't say naming. I said naming is a means of gaining control over something, and it is a form of domination. But you know, we need to be a little careful with this. You know, for instance, to give you an idea that there is imperiality behind it. There's always imperiality behind it, because you assume naming and classifying plants. What lies behind that is a Western system of medicine and science. So living in Africa, we often speak, and when Africa was colonized, we often speak about the discovery, you know, of Africa, and the discovery of plants, and the discovery of this and that. But it is not the discovery of anything. It was already discovered by the local people, you know, and it was known by the local people. But once it is sort of rediscovered and claimed by this Western colonizing, let me use the word forceful, because I can't think of another word, it's late. But you know, then naming and classification, even something that appears to be very innocent and very, in fact, very beneficial to know about plants and animals, and you know, there is something still happening behind that. There are still, you know, and this is something we often, you know, this is the point I'm trying to make. You know, I'm not saying naming is bad. Of course, we need to name things, but what I'm saying is it's always interested. There's always power negotiation, particularly in imperial and colonial contexts. You know, and even the Western biomedical and scientific frame of reference, that in itself is a framework that we need to be aware of. That's all I'm saying. You know, so I take the point. You know, but yeah.
But okay, let me quickly respond to the response.
Sorry.
Sorry, you wanted to say
Candace was going to jump in first, I think.
Okay.
I was just going to say that I think I'm thinking about this. I think every time I think about naming, I think about erasure, like what is removed by naming something. And on top of that, like the naming then creates its own narrative, right? It creates its own beginning that somehow displaces, as you were talking about, Chris, what was there before. And I think that's where the issue lies. Like even in books that try to be helpful, right? Saying, oh, these groups of people refer to X as Z and we refer to it as Y. It implies that like this other way, it's like somehow different or backwards or like should somehow lean into this new way that I'm talking about it. So there's like break, erasure, all of these things. And Jonathan just reminded me that last week I was talking about this in the context of the life of Aaron, where it's very explicit that they're attempting, right, to Christianize an entire frontier, the Nubian frontier. And when one of the stories in which that happens, the characters actually take on Christian names. They refuse to give their Egyptian names and only give the Christian ones. And then when these same characters, their biological father appears to them, they say, you're not our father. This other guy, Macedonius, this bishop is our father and God is our father, but you are not. So they completely rewrite their like genealogical and familial history in the context of this like Christian narrative. And so like that's, it's that sort of thing where it's like, on the one hand, I'm not like, the Christians are being very purposeful. They're about how they're imagining the world being transformed by language and how it's used. So like, in that sense, I get, this is where all of these sort of like really contentious ideas like collide into one.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because it becomes then a question of what it is that you think is most important in your own identity, or perhaps what someone else might think is most important for you. And I recognize those are different, but of course, like the two people you say, they take on new names and they choose to do this deliberately. I think of Cassian's monks as well, or others, they deliberately enter the monastery, take new names, and with it, imagine that their old self is quite literally dead. But that's because their identity is oriented around a community and a set of practices and values that has shifted quite dramatically. And now, but then I want to say that might be a bit different from a lot of what we see in like encyclopedias or taxonomical literature, which gives the name there is this, the name here is this. Is every attempt at translation going to suffer from this issue of creating an us them, right? The name there is X. The name that we would give it is Y. Could be creating an us them binary, or it could be attempting to translate. And how can we distinguish those?
Yeah.
And I asked this as a question because now I'm genuinely kind of baffled.
So I'm just keeping an eye on time. We've sort of gone over our time, I think, but
could I say just a quick sort of
okay, yes, go ahead, Joanne.
response to the responses, but just to say, okay, the empire that I'm defending, by the way, is not Western. It's not Western, and it's way before the Greeks. So, and it's not really an empire, I mean, in some sense, but it gets claused the ultimate evil empire. And I'm just sort of, I understand the colonial problem. I understand a lot of these things, the missionary problem and so forth. And I sympathize tremendously with all of that. But I agree then, I wanted to agree with the last Jonathan, that we need to be somewhat careful about that. It isn't always like that, that there are other things. So the Septuagint, for example, is a translation. It was intended to make Jewish scriptures available and was commissioned for that purpose, to make available to Greeks who are interested in it. And we can see the influence on Ovid's Metamorphoses directly from the Septuagint. So yeah, you have to be careful with this. Not every name naming, not everything is that way. And so just in any individual case, it's good to distinguish between the, okay, this is the sinister use, this is the power grab, this is the hurting other people use, as opposed to this is intended just to figure out what you're talking about and to help people to understand what, get you on the same page. Yeah, very good, excellent.
Thanks, Joanne. So thank you everyone for being here today. Thanks to all our presenters in particular. And we're looking forward to another group of papers tomorrow. We have had one person withdraw tomorrow again, but it's our last paper. So we'll be able to keep on schedule, and we'll be on a very similar schedule as today. So I hope you can join us, and it was lovely to see all of you for a while today, and have a good rest of the whatever part of the day it is. Evening, morning, go back to bed, some of you, go to bed, some of you. Okay. Anyway, take good care, and thanks again.
Thanks so much, Heidi. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Candace, could you stand for just a few seconds?
Zoe.
Candace?
Oh, yes, I can stay for a few seconds.
Just a few seconds. I wanted to tell you two things. One is on the liminal of women. That's directly expressed in my culture, that women are actually believed to travel to the netherworld, to gain the soul, to bring back to place the human body. They're responsible for the soul. And they go on the boat, and that the problems, of course, come when they don't make it back from the journey. And there's a goddess who is directed, who pulls the boat for them, and who also determines the sex of the child. So I just thought you'd be interested, the direct
Oh, that
statement.
is so true.
And she's a goddess of liminality, specifically, that's what she does. So anyway, this idea of women as liminal is directly expressed. I mean, we have actual evidence that somebody noticed this and said something about it in antiquity. And the other thing I wanted to say is that there is a very subtle and very interesting, shall we say, pushback on the Christianization of Nubia. There are some elements in Nubian churches that are actually Zoroastrian, distinctly Zoroastrian.
Yeah, it's the interest. I'm always skeptical